A serious brain injury presented by Ken. I'd like to speak to you about a serious brain injury that potentially anyone can have. It's a broken brain. A broken brain is the result of a dysregulated neurotransmitter pathway circuit. There's a family member of mine that has a life-threatening disease. He contracted the disease and has affected the entire family emotionally, spiritually, and financially. He was told he had two choices, either to continue living as he was and die, or live his life in recovery. Thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ, he chose to seek treatment and live a life of recovery by daily practicing the 12 steps of AA. I'm referring to the disease of psychoactive substance addiction. I'd like to give you a personal testimony. Over 10 years ago, my wife and I heard a startling statement from two friends of our son. They said, "Your son is abusing drugs and alcohol and is going to die." At the time, these words seemed unbelievable to us. We didn't know what to do but to pray. I prayed asking God to spare my son's life and take mine. I was willing to die for my son so he could live. I knew my son had a stronghold, so I claimed 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, which says, "For though we live in the body, we do not wage war in an unspiritual way, since the weapons of our warfare are not worldly, but powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. The effectual prayer of a righteous man availeth much." At the time, I had no idea how God was going to deliver my son from Satan's stronghold and spare his life. After months of addiction treatment, counseling, recovery, and family education, we now understand the disease of addiction and the process of recovery. I'd like to share with you the treatment events that followed. My son reluctantly agreed to his wife's plea for him to seek treatment at a detox facility in Biloxi, Mississippi for 10 days, followed by 30 days at the Bradford Health Services in Warrior, Alabama, and the Brookwood Hospital in Birmingham, Alabama. From there, he was transferred to Bradford Health Services Halfway House, the Reprieve in Auburn, Alabama, for 30 days. From there, he returned home. Once at home, he slipped and returned to abusing psychoactive substances. Once again, it took a loved one to intervene and convince my son to return to Bradford Health Services in Warrior. I will never forget that night when my son and I drove 5 hours to Warrior, arriving after midnight. Upon our arrival, I proceeded to enter the facility before my son. As he was approaching the entrance, I happened to look over my shoulder and noticed that he had discarded a brown bag in the bushes. I thought it was trash. Later, during his process interview with the medical staff, I decided to check out what he discarded in the bushes. To my dismay, I discovered a hypodermic needle filled with what could have been a lethal dose of cocaine. At that moment, I was so saddened and ashamed that my son was willing to inject drugs into his body. Because illicit drugs are not allowed on Bradford's campus, I gave the bag to the medical staff and explained who put it there. The staff person said, "We cannot accept your son into our program because he is suicidal." I replied, "What am I to do with him at 3 a.m. in the morning in the middle of nowhere?" The staffer said, "We'll transfer him by ambulance to the psychiatric unit at Brookwood Hospital in Birmingham." Later, my son was transferred from the psychiatric unit to Bradford's The Reprieve Halfway House in Auburn, Alabama again. Upon his completion of 30 more days of treatment, he returned home and has enjoyed over 10 years of sobriety. His sobriety has not been without medical problems. He had a digestive disorder that required hospitalization and multiple visits to the Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic. While in Jacksonville, Florida, we were talking and praying together in our hotel room, and he told me something that I had not told anyone about. He said, "Dad, do you remember the last time you took me to Warrior, Alabama? I wanted to kill myself." I said, "Yes, I knew that." He said, "Well, how did you know?" Then I told him how I had prayed months ago, pleading with God to spare your life and take mine. Little did I know that God would answer my fervent prayer by using me to discover the brown bag you threw into the bushes. It wasn't a coincidence that I turned and looked back at the right moment. It was God that caused me to do so. My son was amazed at how God had spared his life and realized that he had a purpose for his life. This next slide talks about the possible factors contributing to the broken brain. The first is genetic predisposition, that is, a family history of psychoactive substance addiction. It's my non-medical opinion that it's more of an environmental predisposition rather than a genetic one. For example, if you're raised in a family where your parents use and abuse psychoactive substances, you may believe it's okay to do the same. Once a person begins to use and abuse psychoactive substances, they may become addicted to those substances. Number 2, a traumatic blow to the head. Number 3, a traumatic psychological event. High fever. And last, chronic use and abuse of psychoactive substances. How many people say, "When I grow up, I want to be an alcoholic or a drug addict"? Of course, no one plans nor expects to become an alcoholic or drug addict. However, some people believe they can use and abuse psychoactive substances without any consequences. Let's say a person scores having the first 4 out of 5 predisposing factors: genetic history, traumatic blow to the head, traumatic psychological event, and a high fever. Does that mean the person is predetermined and predestined to become an alcoholic and or drug addict? No. However, a higher number of predisposing factors do increase the probability if the person becomes a chronic user and abuser of psychoactive substances. On the other hand, if a person never drinks or uses drugs, they will never become addicted. Despite the misconceptions and value judgments people place on psychoactive substance addiction, it's in many ways similar to other chronic diseases, such as type 2 diabetes and coronary artery disease. Voluntary choices can contribute to the onset of chronic diseases as well. For example, a person who chooses to eat an unhealthy diet and not exercise increase their risk for coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Likewise, the initial choice to use psychoactive substances is voluntary, but once addiction develops, its use is compulsive, not voluntary. This slide shows 5 out of 300 major neurotransmitters that may play a role in the addiction process. The first is endorphins. These morphine-like neurotransmitters reduce pain, alleviate stress, and promote pleasure. GABA. This neurotransmitter quiets the brain by blocking stimulation, including anxiety and worry. 3. Norepinephrine. Similar to adrenaline, this neurotransmitter affects heart rate and blood pressure and is involved in the body's natural fight or flight response to emergencies. Serotonin. This neurotransmitter affects motor function, pain perception, appetite, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is not subject to voluntary control. And finally, dopamine, a neurotransmitter that is plentiful in the brain's reward circuit. It's the brain's primary pleasure messenger. Normally, dopamine is released in the brain when it's stimulated by enjoyable activities such as eating a delicious meal, having sex with your spouse, or watching your favorite football team win. This slide represents a neuron. The brain contains up to 1 trillion cells called neurons. Neurons communicate with each other by releasing chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, across a synapse space to an adjacent neuron's special receiving receptor site, just as a lock is designed to accommodate a specific key. An average neuron forms approximately 1,000 synapses with other neurons. It is estimated that there are more synapses in the brain than there are stars in the galaxy. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to be smarter or wiser than others? Well, partly the reason is the neurons form new synapses or strengthen synaptic connections in response to life experiences. This positive dynamic change in neuronal connections is the basis of learning. However, the neurotoxic effects of psychoactive substances cause negative changes in the anatomy and physiology of neurons. For example, alcohol, methamphetamines, and ecstasy kill neurons. Alcohol kills neurons that help create new memories, therefore decreasing the capacity for learning. This is a PET scan. Cocaine and amphetamine can cause the activity of the brain to decrease. A PET scan of cocaine addicts shows that the metabolism of glucose, a primary fuel for neurons, is drastically reduced at 100 days and continues to be diminished up to 1 year following cessation of the drug abuse. This slide demonstrates a normal neurotransmission and function of a dopamine transporter. When a normal brain is not under the influence of a psychoactive substance, it is in a state of equilibrium. A person can enjoy the pleasurable effects of a normal life, from eating, relationships, hobbies, and sex with their spouse. Now, I'd like to demonstrate this to further clarify what you're seeing. This represents a neuron on this side, and this represents a neuron. And let's assume that you just ingested your favorite pie, and the impulse is sent to your brain from your mouth, and it causes these little vesicles that contain dopamine, the pleasure messenger, to be released in the synaptic space. And they go specifically to a receptor site to transmit that impulse to the next neuron. And again, dopamine only goes to its specific receptor, where other neurotransmitters go to their specific receptor. So it's like a lock and key, and once it unlocks, it goes back through what's called a transporter. It's a reuptake pump that takes the dopamine back into that neuron, and it's stored in the vesicle to be used again. That is a normal neurotransmission and function of dopamine transporter. This slide shows that almost all psychoactive substances change the way the brain works by affecting neurotransmission in a specific way. So each one of these drugs that you see affect the brain in a specific area. However, alcohol affects all the neurotransmission pathways. Alcohol is the most widely abused legal substance in the world. Medical complications arising from its abuse include alcoholism, ulcers, cancer of the lip, oral cavity, esophagus, larynx, stomach, and liver, anemia, menstrual irregularities, infertility, loss of sex drive, reduction of testosterone levels, impotence, irreversible brain damage, osteoporosis, alcoholic hepatitis, liver cirrhosis, cardiomyopathy, nerve damage, and pancreatitis. Here's an illustration of a healthy liver, a cirrhosis liver, and a cancerous liver. Let's talk about nicotine. Researchers have identified more than 250 chemicals in tobacco smoke that are toxic or cancer-causing in humans. Nicotine is absorbed rapidly into the bloodstream and takes only seconds to reach the brain, having a direct effect on the body for up to 30 minutes. Nicotine causes epinephrine to be released, resulting in a sudden surge of glucose, increased blood pressure, respiration, and heart rate. Nicotine indirectly excites the dopamine-containing neurons to produce more action potential. Nicotine is highly addictive, similar to other psychoactive substances like cocaine and heroin. As a result, 7 out of 10 smokers would like to quit. There are smoking-related diseases: abdominal aortic aneurysm, acute myeloid leukemia, cataracts, cervical cancer, kidney cancer, pancreatic cancer, pneumonia, periodontitis, stomach cancer, bladder, esophageal, laryngeal, lung, oral, and throat cancer, chronic lung disease, coronary heart and cardiovascular disease, reproductive effects, and sudden death infant syndrome. Now, vaping is just as harmful and addictive as traditional cigarettes. A new generation of high schoolers are getting addicted to nicotine at an increase of 900% in vaping. 40% of new vapors have never used tobacco before. Here's an example of a healthy lung, a cancerous lung. Let's talk about caffeine. Caffeine inhibits the neurotransmitter adenosine from binding with its receptor, increasing activity and arousal levels. Normally, the adenosine binding with the receptor causes sedation. Too much caffeine may cause addiction, insomnia, anxiety, digestive problems, muscle breakdown, high blood pressure, rapid heart rate, and fatigue. Now, I'd like to describe this slide. Another way to affect synaptic transmission is to alter the removal of neurotransmitters from the synapses. Cocaine and amphetamines block the dopamine receptor, the dopamine transporter that moves or removes dopamine from the synapses. The result is a rapid rise of dopamine in the synapses, leading to feelings of euphoria and well-being. Again, this is one neuron. Here's another. This person has ingested, say, cocaine, which stimulates the release of dopamine from the vesicle into the synaptic space, and that drug also blocks the reuptake pump transporter, not allowing the dopamine to be recycled into the vesicle. At the same time, you'll note, just by example, we had 3 receptors over here with locks. We only have 2 now. And the reason for that is the more a psychoactive substance is abused, the more dopamine receptors are reduced as the brain attempts to regain its equilibrium. You can see that they're now just 1. If dopamine cannot connect with a receptor, it can't deliver the pleasure message. As a result, a use no longer provides the same high, so the user must increase the dose of substance in order to achieve the same effects. Thus, tolerance and the need for increasing amounts of the substance is developed. If the user stops using, they will experience cravings or intense desire for the substance. Cravings arise from the brain's need to maintain a state of homeostasis. That means it's including the presence of a psychoactive substance. Alcoholics and addicts find it difficult to experience the pleasurable effects of a normal life, for their brains lose receptivity to the normal pleasures of life. They often become isolated from family, friends, have difficulty at work or school, and may become involved with crime and the criminal justice system. Let's talk about the limbic reward system. The limbic reward system is involved in many of our emotions and motivations. The TVA, that is the ventral tegmental area right here in the midbrain, neurons here specifically produce and regulate pleasure related to survival. It is amazing how God created our brains to experience pleasure from repeating 3 life-sustaining activities. In order for the earth to continue to be populated with humans, we must eat, drink, and procreate. The normal pleasure received from repetitively eating our favorite meal, drinking water, or having sex with our spouse results from our brain's release of dopamine at a level of 200%. God created us this way for our own good. Without repeating these 3 behaviors, mankind cannot survive. Now compare the abnormal pleasure received from the use or abuse of a psychoactive substance that can produce a dopamine level of up to 1,000%. Neurons in the VTA relay their message through the nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cerebral cortex region, having to do with decision-making, reasoning, and judgment. Psychoactive substance addiction is a disease that consistently tells a user there's nothing wrong. Their life may be falling apart, yet their brain says, "You're okay. You can handle this," or "You don't have a problem." This twisted perception is insanity. The assumption is that once you remind people of the foolishness of their behavior, they will be motivated to stop. Obviously, both reasoning and will are important in making moral decisions and exercising self-control, but in the broken brain, reasoning and will are not processed in the moral conscious choice area of the brain, that is, the prefrontal cortex area, but in the midbrain, an amoral, reflexive, unconscious survival level of the brain. In the addicted brain, the midbrain becomes stronger than the cortical processing. When a psychoactive substance induces a surge of dopamine, the midbrain will recognize a dramatic relief in stress and tag the substance as a survival coping mechanism. At this point, the line is crossed over from an abusing to an addicted brain. As far as the midbrain is concerned, the psychoactive substance is life itself. The question is, how do you treat a broken brain? You treat it with abstinence. You practice AA 12 steps daily. You talk often with a sponsor and attend regularly AA and NA meetings. And sobriety can be maintained the rest of one's life. I hope this presentation has helped you understand how psychoactive substances affect the brain and how to treat a broken brain. Thank you for your attention.